a hard job. It's kind of like a lifetime. You don't sign a contract to be a Rabbi. So it's like all these people's lives are like looking up to you, and there's nowhere to go. You can't retire. There's no like retirement plan. There's no retirement community for rabbis. It's a lifetime. It's a lifetime position. So there's a version that it was. Then came Simchas Torah, and essentially, whichever version, Rabbi Mordechai Yosef knew that there was something that was going to take place, and he asked his closest followers to meet him, and he's going to have his own akafas in his home rather than in the main shul. And sure enough, in the main shul, when the Kotzk finally came out of his room, he ran over to the person who was holding the Torah, because he assumed it was Mordechai Yosef, one of his most senior disciples, and grabbed the Torah out of his arm as if to say, "You get out of here. You don't belong here." Turns out it was just some other chassid, nobody that the Kotzk had anything against. But he clearly grabbed it and said something that made everybody who was there think that he thought that it was the Ishbitzer, that it was Mordechai Joseph who was holding the Torah. So Mordechai Joseph knew that he was basically at the end of the line in his relationship in some capacity as a chassid, senior most, nevertheless, of the Kotzker, of Rabbi Mendel of Kotzk. And then he left right after that, a massive group. Some people say it was over 80% originally of the Chassidim who were in Kotzk at that time. Because you have to understand there was already like trouble brewing. They knew there was something wrong. And when they saw and things were deteriorating, so a massive amount of Chassidim left with Mordechai Yosef. However, not all of those Chassidim remained with him. A number of them, over time, went back to the Kotzker. When it became clear that the Kotzker, although was in some form of seclusion and would just come out occasionally and usually kind of rebuke the people who were around, like, "What are you here for?" After being in his room for weeks on end, and come out and give some sharp words, nevertheless Chassidim still returned, including some of the great Chassidim that would found their own dynasties. However, many great Chassidim did come, not just amount of Chassidim, but also the quality. Some of the quality Chassidim did come with Rabbi Mordechai Yosef, and some of them founded their own school. In fact, we're actually following the dynasty of the family dynasty, but it could be argued and said that in many Polish schools they didn't closely follow the father, son, or grandson kind of paradigm of Hasidism, although they did in most. But there were many schools where the most senior disciple essentially was elected or chosen to be the Rebbe, and Ishbitz was kind of one of those places that was divided. A lot of the places divided. After the death of the first Rebbe, there would be a son and a senior disciple. And in some cases, the majority of people would follow the son. In other cases, a majority of people would follow the senior disciple. It seems actually that probably the majority of the people didn't actually follow Rabbi Yaakov Leiner, the son of the Hashiloach, and the majority of them followed instead of Leibele Eger, the grandson of the very famous Rabbi Akiva Eger, who became a chassid, which is a big deal, who was considered the foremost disciple of Rabbi Mordechai Yosef. Sometimes it had to do also with age, that the Rebbe's son may not have been, might have been a lot younger than a lot of the Chassidim. So it was very hard for the Chassidim to all of a sudden transfer to somebody who's 20 years old, and when they could find the top Chassid who was already teaching in the life of the Rebbe, who's 50, who has a large following. I'll give you more about the ages next week when we get there. That's not really the topic of today. There's a variety of reasons. For example, tonight actually is Yutas Kislev, when people commemorate the freeing from the Tsarist prison of the Alter Rebbe of Chabad. So most people don't know that when the Alter Rebbe of Chabad passed away, his most senior disciple started his own movement. which his followers thought was going to be Chabad, even though they didn't call Chabad. They're called, it's called Strashella. Rabbi of Strashella started his own movement. But he didn't feel that it was his own movement. He felt it was the valid continuation of what the Alter Rebbe was teaching. And he wrote Svarim that were based on the Tanya and other works of the Alter Rebbe.
The same as the Malachim?
No, that happened later.
Oh.
So you have this, you've got this concept, thank you. You have this concept of a disciple or a son. So now, what happened with the Ishbitzer? Not only did he not stress this concept of finding the truth in terms of getting rid of all of the BS in your internal life, he emphasized something that at face value seems to be totally the opposite. I have a theory that actually if you look deeply enough, they're interconnected, but not in an obvious way. How so? What he put forward is a view that's very, very, very non-conformist to traditional Judaism. He puts forward a very dangerous perspective. There's a concept, we call it antinomianism, which means being beyond law. So, lahavdil, Christianity, is by and large, even though they have some laws, but relatively to the way they took a relationship with the Bible, with the Chumash, and the Jewish oral traditions of the time, that was antinomian, that they didn't keep the majority of the laws. They kept a very few laws. And the laws that they did keep, many of them weren't even part of Judaism. Their faith in Jesus is not part of Judaism. Lahavdil, between another religion and a part of Judaism that also failed to be part of normative Judaism but didn't become Christians, was Shatzai Tzvi. And Shatzai Tzvi was in the beginning somewhat antinomian, but not totally. I remember reading as a kid these novels about Shatzai Tzvi, how they would all of a sudden make a bracha on ham and say, now Mashiach is coming and we have to sanctify the ham, we have to sanctify the pork. They were moving in that direction, and then that's actually what happened. Once Shatzai Tzvi underwent a conversion to Islam, he eventually said, well, the Torah doesn't have to be fulfilled in its legal sense. We can get the inner understanding of it. Again, not to compare these things to each other. Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism is saying, let's get to Judaism without having to keep the law. So they did away with kashrus. I was reading the history of Reform Judaism in America over the weekend. I picked up a book of Isabel Friedman. And it has the story of Isaac Mayer Weiss and his first rabbinical school. And the first graduating class, they went to a non-kosher restaurant and he told them, no ham.